So I'm going to start the recording now. And I will start with, we want to start with today with a land acknowledgement, because something that we feel that is super important is we want to make sure that we are acknowledging the land that we are having this event on, depending on whether or not we're on Zoom or if we're actually physically in person in the North Adams Berkshires region. We want to make sure we're acknowledging the land that we are inhabiting on currently that wasn't always ours. So through Heather Bruegl, one of the panelists we have today, she has this great guide of how to write and to acknowledge land acknowledgements correctly. And so that's something that I followed in developing one of these land acknowledgements that we did not have a written one for, but we also have one that was pre-written through the Stockbridge-Munsee Community for the Mohican land. So her guidance is to create these land acknowledgements through don't make assumptions, reach out to the Native nation that you want to acknowledge the past and the contemporary, and make sure there's an action item included in there to show that there's just a genuine, authentic want to grow and build through that. So the land acknowledgement for the Williamstown, Pittsfield area of the Mohican land is, it is with great gratitude and humility that we acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous peoples of this land. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Munsee Community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. And then I would also like to acknowledge the land that MCLA and the North Adams campus falls on, which is Wabanaki Confederacy land. So we acknowledge that we are gathering and speaking on the ancestral homelands of the Wabanaki Confederacy, a confederacy of the Micmac, Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, and Abenaki nations. Known as the people of the Dawnland, the tribes of the Wabanaki Confederacy were indigenous to the lands of contemporary Maine, Vermont, northwestern Massachusetts, and parts of Canada, and continue to reside in these areas. We honor their indigeneity to this land and commit to acknowledging their founding of this land in our community. And so we wanted to start with this today because we just think it's really important to acknowledge this land. And it's just a good example because this is good practice. We could be introducing our classes in this way. This could be ways that we join and start any sort of group gathering or conversation. So these are just a great way to acknowledge the land that we're on and who were here before us. And so to get right into the conversation, I want to start by introducing our panelists today. We have Talya Kingston from WAM Theatre, the director of the Thanksgiving play. Talia Kingston is a dramaturg, playwright, and educator with a particular interest in new play development and theater for social change. She works at WAM Theatre as the associate artistic director and has just finished directing WAM's digital production of the Thanksgiving play by Larissa Fasthorse. Talia is joining us today from her home in Amherst, Massachusetts, traditional homelands of the Nipmuc and Pecumtuck nations. So thank you, Talia, for being here with us today. And let me just see, I think Lisa's in the waiting room, so let me make sure that she can get in. Okay, she's good. And then next I'd like to introduce Heather Bruegl. Heather Bruegl, a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and first-line descendant Stockbridge-Munsee, is a graduate of Madonna University in Michigan and holds a Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts in U.S. History. Inspired by a trip to Wounded Knee, South Dakota, a passion for Native American history was born. She has spoken for numerous groups, including the University of Michigan, University of Wisconsin-Madison, College of the Menominee Nation, the Kenosha Civil War Museum, Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans, and the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. She has spoken at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh for Indigenous Peoples Day 2017, the Women's March Anniversary in Lansing, Michigan in January 2018, the first ever Indigenous Peoples March in Washington, D.C. in January of 2019, and the Crazy Horse Memorial and Museum in Custer, South Dakota for the Talking Circle series in 2019 and 2020. She has also become the accidental activist and speaks to different groups about intergenerational racism and trauma and helps to bring awareness to our environment, the fight for clean water, and other issues in the Native community. A curiosity of her own heritage led her to Wisconsin, where she has researched the history of the Native American tribes in the area. While Heather calls Michigan home, she has recently moved to Wisconsin and is now the Director of Cultural Affairs for the Stockbridge-Munsee Community. In addition, she currently travels and speaks on Native American history, including policy and activism. Thank you so much, Heather, for being here with us today. We're really excited to have you and to have this conversation with you, Talia. And our last panelist, who is our facilitator, Destiny. Destiny Rivera is a senior at MCLA majoring in English with a concentration in creative writing, as well as arts management. She enjoys writing, mainly short stories and poetry, and plans to pursue a career in the writing field. As a member of the Latine community, she has noticed disparities in representation for people of color. She plans to work to increase representation for people of color and diversifying the field of writing and the arts as a whole. So with that, Destiny, I'll throw it over to you. And like I said, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put those in the chat, and Erica and I will be monitoring that throughout.
Thank you, Declan, for those lovely remarks, and I would like to echo his sentiments and thank Heather and Talia for taking part in this panel today. I believe that it's important when discussing intent to think about the actions behind it, because they do not always align with the actions that we do. So I would like to discuss something that Declan touched upon, which are the land acknowledgements. And I would like to ask the question of what is a land acknowledgement? How would you define it? And why is it important to incorporate it into our daily lives?
Yeah, so thank you guys for hosting this event and reaching out. I'm super stoked to be here, coming to you from my office, which is located on the Stockbridge-Munsee Reservation in Northeast Wisconsin through the Treaty of 1856. So I think that's kind of great that we're coming full circle here from where we were in the past to where we are in the contemporary. And in regards to your questions in terms of land acknowledgements, what they are is they're basically just an acknowledgement of the land. And I think that's super important to point out, that no matter where you're standing in the continental United States, North America, Central America, South America, and the Hawaiian Islands, you're standing on indigenous lands somewhere. Doesn't matter where you're at. And I think it's super important to acknowledge that that land has a history, it has a past, it has a present, and it has a future. And that's one of the things that is so important and something that I push for a lot, because land acknowledgements are simple. They're very easy to do. And as Declan pointed out in his introduction, there's simple steps that you can follow that I've talked about before in order to do a land acknowledgement. And the one of the most important things I think out of anything is to acknowledge the contemporary, because a lot of us are not located on our ancestral lands anymore through forced removal. So like, I'm not on Mohican lands, I'm not on the lands of the Iroquois Confederacy anymore. I'm on reservation land now. So I think that's super important to acknowledge that even through those hardships and through that forced removal, we still built strong, vibrant, beautiful communities no matter where we were. And so you have to acknowledge that contemporary, because if you don't, it almost gives Native Americans like a mystic type of appearance, like we were these people that were here and now they were gone. And we're not. We're here and we're very strong and vibrant, and we want to share with you. We want to share our history and talk about our culture and our tradition and our languages. And so I think that's where land acknowledgements can come in and where they're really important.
Thank you for that great response. A quick follow-up question would be like, what more can we do in addition to land acknowledgements? Because although they're very important and they do a first starting step, what can be some additional steps that we take in order to further that?
Action. In a word, action. It's great to have that acknowledgement, but it doesn't mean jack unless you put something behind it. So you're acknowledging that land, and it's like you know, when you're a little kid and you do something bad and you're forced to apologize to your brother or your sister, and you're just saying it because your parents told you you had to say it. You didn't really mean it. Guilty. The oldest child had to do that a lot. So when you get older and you're apologizing, like when I apologize now, I truly mean it. And I do something, you know, to show that action is so important. And so, yeah, you can have the words, you're honoring the Stockbridge-Munsee people or the Wabanaki Confederacy or however, you can have that. But until you put action into it, to, you know, learn Native history, read a book, watch a documentary, show up when we need you if we're fighting for something, until you put, you know, action into those words, they don't mean anything.
Thank you for that. So a question that's more tailored towards Talia is, since the Thanksgiving play, we're focusing on some of the themes around it. Can you tell us a little more about Thanksgiving play for people who don't know it and its importance in our current climate?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having us in your virtual room today. So yes, so I come from WAM Theatre, and WAM Theatre is based in the Berkshires on Mohican land, and we work at the intersection of arts and activism. So what we try and do is always base that kind of action that Heather was just talking about within our production. So it's one thing to come and see a show and feel a kind of release or catharsis at the end of it, because you've come through some kind of trauma, you've looked at something problematic, and then you come out of it and you feel kind of good that you've seen it. But again, just as Heather said, you haven't actually done anything. You've sat with other people and you've listened to a story, but what do you do afterwards? So we try and always build action steps into our work. Having said that, this play, the Thanksgiving play, is the first play that WAM is producing by a Native American playwright, Larissa Fastos, who is a member of the Lakota Nation. And in doing that, we realized that we had to start by figuring out how to go beyond a land acknowledgement, how to make some connections to the Mohican Nation, because we had been doing land acknowledgements for a couple of years, but we had to figure out how to move beyond that. And then also to have conversations with Larissa and sort of build Native American artists into the piece. The piece itself is a satire of the kind of white, particularly white, but definitely non-native political correctness that is all intent and no action, and all the different problems and foibles and missteps that are made when people try and tell a story that without knowing the history of that story and without having the people who are represented in that story in the room. So it's about what happens when we tell the Thanksgiving story, and we do it from very, very young age in this country, but we tell it in a simplified way that that doesn't have a native voice really within it. And yeah, so that's the play. It's a very funny play, but the humor comes from laughing at, the humor comes from a familiarity of with those mistakes. So you're laughing at yourself, you're laughing at your teachers, you're laughing at things that you're very familiar with.
Yeah, and that relates into my next question is, we've seen this upsurgence of using the arts for activism, and I see that going on with the Thanksgiving play. So how do you think that the Thanksgiving play is using it as a form of social awareness?
I think that Larissa Fastos has a famous quote where she talks about this play, that laughter, in the laughter, you're shifting your consciousness. And so the hope is that people will laugh at things that they've noticed in their own lives, but then they'll be like, oh, that's me actually. And so there's an awareness of, wow, I've made those mistakes and now I have to address them. So along with the production, this is obviously a digital production because of COVID, there's a list of action steps that you can take. And the idea is that there are steps that you can take as soon as you finish watching the production, if you like. So there are things like as simple as looking up where you are zooming in from, because yes, most of our audience will be on the traditional lands of the Mohican tribe, but because it's Zoom, they could be anywhere in the country or the world. So we have ways for people to look that up and then to go deeper. We have recommended book lists by indigenous authors, recommended children's book lists for young children by indigenous authors. We have ways of rethinking and reframing Thanksgiving, because obviously we've timed it so that it lines up with the holiday so that people can really be rethinking it. And hopefully that will lead into conversations around the holiday table or within a household. So there are a lot of different fairly simple steps that people can take, which honestly will really enrich their understanding of where they live. It's a very joyful experience, in my experience, to have that learning. It shouldn't necessarily be a hard thing to address.
Yeah, and I have the next question, which relates to that for both Heather and Talia, which is, there's individuals who want to support social causes because they believe they're important, but because they don't know a lot about the information, how can they fix their ignorance? So how can we work to get rid of whitewashed narratives, whether in stories in a play or through education, because we see that it can impede social justice causes?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, there's a process of unlearning that has to happen. I think from, the time you enter kindergarten, the story, particularly if we focus on Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims and the Indians, and you make your little, hat with the feather, and, you're running around and all of that fun stuff. But so from the time you enter into public or private educational, institutions, you're told one thing. And so when you get through, elementary school, middle school, high school, and then on to your post-secondary education, you think you have a feel on what's going on until you encounter someone like myself, let's say, who is a historian who does lecture on Native history, and I'm telling you something completely different. And it's like, hold up, there's a lot of resistance that you feel at first. There's a lot of betrayal that you can feel because you feel like you were taught something that was false, that was a false narrative, when inside of each of those narratives, there's a string of truth. You just have to find it. But I understand, our educational institutions are bound by certain requirements that you have to meet. And so there isn't, that great amount of time to be able to go into something, as important as Thanksgiving or, things that have happened in history. And so I think before somebody can become an ally and get involved, there's that process, like I said, of unlearning that you have to learn and that you have to go through first. And it can be related to a grieving process, because you're having to come to terms with, not that you were lied to, but that you were told some untruths, and now you've got to wade your way through that and find the truth. And when I do lectures and stuff, I'm gentle with you. I let you know that you're gonna hear something you might not like, and that's okay. We can have a dialogue about it. But I think it's important to understand also that history is written by the victors. So you're only getting one side of it 90% of the time, and to understand those other sides is super important before you can even step into the role of being an ally. You've got to understand there's more than just what you were taught in school.
Yeah, thank you. Is there anything you would like to add, Talia, about the Thanksgiving play? Because the Thanksgiving play is a version of when a whitewash narrative tries to force itself into the forefront rather than having Native people at the center. So would you like to add something to it?
Yeah, absolutely. It satirizes that. So actually what we see is a series of whitewash narratives being tried on in front of our eyes. So we get to experience the damage of that within the play. So yeah, no, I totally agree with Heather that it's a process of unlearning, and it's a process of taking, because history is written by the victors, it's a process of deliberately looking for books and media that are written from another perspective, that place another protagonist at the center, so that you get to shift your perspective, which will allow you to open up and see a broader, the other strands of history represented, and a broader, probably truer version emerging. I was worried when I first started, this is sort of tangential to what you just asked, but I was sort of blown away by this play when I first read it, because I recognized myself honestly in it. And I thought it was really important in that regard. And one of the reasons that I was thinking of bringing it to, that it was important to bring it to life, is that it shifted, yes, that it did shift that narrative. Sorry, I lost my strand of thought. That's in the middle of that. I'll pass back to you, Destiny.
Oh, so since we're discussing education and how important education is to learning, because as we know, there's a lot of histories of education that's not discussed, whether it's African history or history of Latin American countries. So why is it important to include Native history in the classrooms in order to decolonize our minds and our curriculums?
Oh my God, why isn't it important? I mean, sorry, that I was very forceful with that, with my words right there at that moment. One of my favorite activists, authors, poets in the indigenous community is a gentleman, a Lakota man by the name of John Trudell. And he said that we are more than just Indians, we are the human beings. And when he was saying that, it was in terms of we are the humans. We were the first peoples to inhabit Turtle Island, what we know as the Western Hemisphere, basically North America. And to not learn the history of the first peoples who inhabited the shores that were discovered is such a disservice, not just to the Native students you have sitting in your classrooms, but to the Native communities that are still alive all around this country, who are still breathing and vibrant and telling their histories. It's almost, to not talk about that history is a form of erasure. And that's not cool. It's not cool. And like, we have such huge, awesome pasts. Our histories, you know, yes, they are tragic, and I don't sugarcoat that at all. They are super sad at times, but the story of resilience is beyond compare. And the story of the indigenous person, of the Black person, of the Latinx person, that's entwined in the red, white, and blue of the United States flag. Like, it's part of it. That's who we are. And so you have to have that conversation in those classes. You have to have those hard conversations in those classes. I was very lucky when I was in college that I had professors who anything went. We talked about anything and everything, even in my history classes. And I was very lucky that you know, we were able to have those conversations. But what really disturbed me the most is that I couldn't see myself in the people that were teaching me. So you can't just decolonize that curriculum. You've got to bring in those indigenous teachers, the Black teachers, the Latinx teachers, to teach that history. Because I mean, my words got jumbled because I just got so passionate about it. But it's just so important. You can't ignore that. And ignoring that causes so many problems, as we can see that's happened over just 2020, which feels like it is going on forever. If we ignore those problems of the past, we repeat them. And that's what we're doing right now. So if Talia wants to add anything to that, I would love to hear.
No, I totally agree.
Yeah, I agree, because I've heard from activists a similar sentiment for what you're saying, Heather, is that rather than ignoring all the trauma that occurs, some people think, oh, if ignore it because it's the past and we don't have to think about it and it's over. But by ignoring it, you're reopening these wounds, because some of these wounds have not healed. They're generational and they're being passed on to people. And just because you think it's leaving, it's still there. And so it's interesting. You and Talia consider yourself historians. What do you think the role of history and preserving history, whether it's Native history or the history of other individuals that are been marginalized in the past, how it works to uplift them?
Can you repeat your question?
How does your role as a historian work to preserve the history of these people whose history has not been uplifted in the past?
That's a good question. Talia, do you want to tackle it first?
Yeah, I will say that I studied history in college, but I'm not a historian like Heather. I am very much a theatre practitioner. However, at WAM, we do tend to, our main mission actually is gender specific. We're working in intersectional feminism, but one of the, it's similar in that we saw a landscape in the American theatre where we were seeing mostly plays by and featuring as the central character a white man. And so everybody else was sort of slotting into the sideline characters. So one of the things we've done at WAM repeatedly is offer historical plays, or plays that examine history, but from a female perspective, and most recently by women who are not white, who are from different groups. This play actually deals with whiteness, but it deals with whiteness in a very critical way. Like, how do we figure out how to open up to other stories? How do we realize that we're not the central protagonist always? And so I think that it can be done in historical reenactment of that on stage or on film, but it needs to be done in a critical way and in a way that incorporates action. But again, I'm not a historian, so I'm going to pass to the historian now.
The way I see my role as a historian is not just to talk about the history that we all know and that we could recite off the top of our heads. It's to talk about that history that's not talked about. So while you're also talking about that mainstream history. So I recently, just did something where I was talking about decolonizing curriculum and how simple it is, how easy it actually can be. So like if you're talking about the American Revolution, right? There were free Black men and women who fought in the American Revolution, but we don't talk about that. We don't mention them. We talk about George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and that's all well and great, but let's talk about the real people that were there. When we talk about events that happened within the Revolution, there's the Boston Massacre. The first fatality of the Boston Massacre was a man by the name of Crispus Attucks, who was of African and indigenous descent. Boom, that took me 30 seconds to work that into something. So you have to talk about the history that isn't always there, that the underlying is. And so as my job as a female in a predominantly male-dominated field, which is history, and an indigenous person, my goal has always been from the start is to talk about that history that we don't hear, to give voices to those who don't always have that voice. So I focus predominantly on indigenous history, but I work in my Black brothers and sisters and Latinx people because their history is my history. It's part of it. What makes, the fabric of the United States is all of those histories woven together.
Thank you so much. That's a very great answer, even though you said you tripped up a little bit. But to read a little bit back in to talk about the decolonizing of curriculum, there's a lot of individuals who, even though they have privilege, they don't know how to fight against it because there's a disconnect between them acknowledging their privilege and acting upon it. And so there's this great clip from the Thanksgiving play that Talia shared with, which Declan is going to play, which shows some of the mistakes that can happen when you don't work towards fighting your privilege.
I am a vegan, so that subject is particularly sensitive to me. However, I want to lift up the acknowledgement that although my sensitivity about the slaughter of millions of animals, including 45 million turkeys, is valid, I am conscious of not allowing my personal issues to take up more space in the room than the justified anger of Native people around this idea of Thanksgiving in our post-colonial society. Yeah, I want to make that crystal clear.
So as you can see in that clip, one of the characters, Logan, created this false equivalency between her veganism and the erasure of Native history, also the massacre that occurred. And this is one of the mistakes that can happen when you have privilege and you're not acknowledging it nor fighting against it. So the question I would like to offer up are, what are the mistakes that individuals with privilege can make when trying to fight against their privilege / help others?
Oh my goodness. Can I start?
Yeah, of course.
So yeah, absolutely, Destiny, you're absolutely right. There's a false equivalency placed, and she started by saying she's not going to take up any space. And what did she do? She took up space. She took up space when at that moment she thinks she has a Native person in the room. Not to give too many spoilers, because I hope you'll all see the show, but the show shows a series of problems that and places that people with privilege, particularly white people in America, throw themselves into the conversation. And the main thing, though, is that they don't have a Native voice in the room. And one thing I've heard time and time again as I've been talking to Indigenous people around this play is nothing for us without us. Like, who are you talking to in making this, in having this conversation? Who's there? So they'd done all their research. They had research. They had this sense that they had all these deadlines. They got a grant and they were working towards the grant, but without really thinking about why they were doing it. The intent wasn't really concrete. They didn't have a good intention behind it. And then the action was not to do with uplifting Native voices. The action was to do with creating a play that fulfilled the grant. So it, again, centered them constantly. So that's, in this play, you get a series of examples of what you just asked.
Yeah, I just to piggyback on what Talia was saying, because I think it's so poignant in that clip where, you know, I don't want to take up space because I want to, you know, put your voice forward, but however, and then she goes and she does it anyways, and like that clip really made me laugh. That was so funny. But like that's the thing that happens is, and how you combat that, how you use your privilege to be able to be a vegan, which costs money, which is not a privilege that a lot of people can have, is you know, you just be quiet and you push the Native voice forward, or you push the Black voice forward, or you push the Latinx voice forward. You let them speak. I was on a panel recently for a diversity and inclusion workshop at a conference, at a museum conference I just attended. And it was diversity and inclusion. And I couldn't get a word in edgewise. And I was just baffled by this. I'm like, you guys are talking about me? Without actually like talking to me or other people of color who were sitting in that panel with us. Why not ask us how you can best serve your privilege? I'm not going to show, I mean, even as a person, an Indigenous woman, I'm not going to show up to, let's say, a Black Lives Matter rally and think I know everything that's going on. No, I'm going to turn to my Black brothers and sisters who are leading the charge and say, what do you need me to do? Where do you need me to stand? And that is, I think, what needs to be done all the way around with those who want to call themselves allies or use their privilege in a way that can help. Show up, but then ask us, what do you need me to do? How can I best serve you in this capacity?
Can I ask you actually to say more on that? Because as we were discussing that some people can acknowledge their privilege, but they don't know how to combat it with action. What are some action steps that people can use when they know they're at a place of privilege, but aren't sure what they should do?
Right. Well, I think the first thing they can do is acknowledge that privilege that you have. I think that's a hard step for a lot of people to even want to say, because they look at it as, oh, if I acknowledge I have this privilege, then it's bad. No, it's not bad. It's just how it is. I mean, that's just how things have rolled in this country for a very long time. So acknowledging that you have that privilege is not a terrible thing. Not acknowledging it is the problem. And you have a lot of people who will say, oh, well, I don't know what, privileges you're talking about, they grew up, a different way or whatever. And it's like, not saying that your life hasn't been hard, but you haven't had your outer appearance affect that in any way, shape, or form, because people can look at you and you get to go on in life. I'm married to a non-Native person. I'm married to a white guy. And, even though he suffers from a chronic illness, his path through life is so much more easier than mine. And he just breezes on through, and but he recognizes that. So he's always coming to me and he's saying, what can I do to help you be an ally? And so I tell him, I'm like, you know what, when there's an issue that's happening, and you're in a position to be able to amplify somebody's voice, do it. Amplify their voice, let them be heard. If it's in a case of you and I together, let me be heard, but speak up for us when we're not there. There's a lot of talk, particularly in the social climate that's happening right now, about being, you can't call yourself, I'm going to mess this up. There's like anti-racist and then non-racist. There's like different terms. And one is where, okay, if you want to be a true ally and want to be someone who truly is not racist, what you're going to do is, even when nobody of color is in the room and somebody says something that's totally not cool, you're going to stand up and say, hold on, that was not acceptable. You're not going to tolerate it anywhere. And so that's what I tell people. Use your privilege in that way. Stand up for us when we're not even in the room. And I think if we do more of that, we can see more change, and we can see more openness and acceptance happen of, the actual history of the United States surrounding Thanksgiving and other holidays.
Yeah, and I really liked how you and Talia were talking about how we can work to uplift voices by simply giving space to the individuals who need it. But what are some other ways that we can uplift the voices of whether it's indigenous people / activists or other identities that differ from our own?
That's a good question. So yeah, education. Educate yourself. Education is power. It's power. My grandma used to say, my grandma who never went past the 8th grade education, said they can take anything in the world away from you, but they can't take away your education. And so I think that's the key. And truly being interested, asking questions, reaching out to, if you're interested in indigenous culture, reaching out to the tribes in your area, reaching out to, the museums in your area, checking your museums in the area who might not be, good at decolonizing their museum programming, reaching out to people who have that, that knowledge that you're seeking. It's more than just showing up. It's educating yourself and then educating others.
Talia, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I also think that there's, yes, I guess I'll go off of Heather's educating others, that, so one of the illustrator in the Thanksgiving play is Kateri Wilson, who's a Lakota illustrator and a children's book author. So one of the things I did this year is buy her children books directly from her, not through Amazon, and sent them to the young people in my life, the under 5s in my life, so that there is a way of stepping out and seeing what's out there, what's the culture, what's the music, what's the film. There was a big Native Film Festival happening. I don't know if it's still going on, a National Native Film Festival happening right now. But so the education is not necessarily reading history books, although that's wonderful. It's also, it's through the arts, it's through culture, it's through other directions, and passing those rich resources on to friends and family around the holidays would be a great step, I think, too. And I know that you're building or already have your museum on your reservation, that WAM is hoping that people who watch the play will join us in donating to this museum. But I think that, well, I'll let you talk about it because it's your museum.
Yeah, so the building that I'm currently in was built in the 1970s, and it's a small building, and we have our library on one side, our museum on the other, and it's just a very cramped space. So we actually are in the process of designing and building a brand new cultural center that's going to be housing, we have the largest archives of Mohican history in the world. So we've got that, plus all of our cultural significant objects that we were able to repatriate, and library, because literacy is super important. And so, yeah, we're in the process of, building that, and we are so thankful. When I was talking with Talia about when we first got together about all of this, and she was like, what's one of the ways we can help? And I'm like, you know what? We are trying to raise money for our new cultural center. So, and to be able to bring our programs online. I mean, the pandemic definitely, I think, showed a lot of flaws in the system, not just, economic system, but we were not prepared to go online as fast as we needed to. Granted, we were able to, get most of our stuff online, but, we have a small community. We want to protect our elders and things like that, but we still want them to be part of it. And so, just like, everything has been affected by funding and by federal funding and government and stimulus, all that. Tribal nations have been affected the same way. So we're trying to do our best here in my tiny little corner of our reservation to bring in as much funding as we possibly can, so our tribal funds can be used for other things. It lessens our tribal footprint, so to speak. Those tribal funds can be used to care for our elders, food pantry, things like that. So yeah, we have donation links, which I know Talia will be providing during the Thanksgiving play. And so we have just amazing history here that we want to hold on to and keep telling people about. And that's another form of support, is not just donating, but going to these cultural institutions and learning, buying from Native artists, Native authors. We're lucky, we have a couple different authors in our community. And when people always like, oh, where can I get that book? If I'm out of that book in my gift shop, I'm going to give you the information of the author itself, because I want you to go directly to the source and get it. And, even here, when I stock our gift shop, it's local when we can, and it's 9 times out of 10 indigenous owned or made. We are very much supporting local and indigenous artistry as well. So that, the arts, whether that be theater, reading, or crafting, or photos and things like that. So we're definitely, looking forward to the day when we have our cultural center and we can welcome everyone in person.
So great. Something that I want to discuss, which is something I've actually noticed as of recent, where there'll be people who have really strong, passionate views on social justice cause, but then sometimes the way they talk, they have like incorrect slang or politically incorrect speech, which is hurtful to those marginalized groups. And how can we work on decolonizing even just our language, like the way we speak when we're speaking about like indigenous people or people from other identities?
Yeah, so I can speak to a little bit about that. Words matter, and I think that's something that we all know is super important. When you're getting together with your group of friends, that's just it. They're your group of friends. They're not your tribe. When you are at your workplace and you're gathering around the water cooler to talk, you're just getting together to have a conversation. You're not having a powwow about something. It's very important to understand that what you say matters. And just because if you try to justify what you're saying because somebody else says it, but they're a member of that particular group, doesn't mean you get to say it. It's not your words. There are words, and so I know that's a similar sentiment across other racial groups in the United States. I mean, there are words I would never in a million years say, even though I might hear other people say it. I'm like, you know what, not my word. I don't get to say that. Just like you don't get to take our words and use them in a way that's not appropriate, or use them as insults. I mean, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the term Indian giver, which could be so far from what it actually is. If anything, we had things taken from us. We didn't take anything from y'all. So, I mean, not like you guys, but so just using them it's hurtful. And so I think just understanding the origin of words, where they come from, what they mean, the evolution of it, I think is super important.
I'd just like to add to that. I totally agree. Especially in theatre, we think a lot about words and about how they matter. But in a recent conversation I was in, here in Massachusetts, we talk about the area just east of the Berkshires as the Pioneer Valley. And I was told by a member of the Nipmuc Nation they prefer Connecticut River Valley because it takes away the narrative of pioneer from the area. So we're thinking about and which leads us into a whole discussion of things like sports mascots and our Massachusetts flag, which I know there's a big campaign right now to shift. So there's a lot of different ways, and those are also campaigns that are linked to from the Thanksgiving Play website, so you can find out more about it through that too. Yeah.
Thank you. And that relates to something which I'm going to discuss, where it's important to include the narratives of other people, but how do we need to do it in a way that isn't tokenizing or making the people of color feel uncomfortable? Such as in the Thanksgiving play, there's a part where one of the characters asks the other character, they're like, oh, we hired you to be the Native American, and it's a way that's tokenizing that individual. So how can we create a space for people of other identities and backgrounds without making them feel uncomfortable / tokenized?
I think one of the main things you can do is not rely on that person of color to make you feel better about what you're thinking or what you're feeling, or to do the research or legwork for you. A lot of the times, just because there is a person of color in the room, they're all of a sudden the expert on everything for that entire group of people. While I'm an indigenous historian, I'm by no means an expert. I mean, there are people out there who can speak way better than I can and who I admire, and who I hope I can be one day, but don't rely solely on that person to do all the legwork for you. Do the work yourself. I mean, we carry computers in our pockets all day long. You can look up information. You don't have to rely on it. It's not that we're not going to help you, but do the legwork first. It's exhausting. It is 110% exhausting having to always feeling like you're the person because you're indigenous. You know, they're going to ask you all about Native history, or you're Black, so they're going to ask you about, you know, slavery or the South or whatever. It's exhausting. Do the research yourself. We're going to help you in any way, shape, or form we can, but don't come to me and expect me to do the legwork for you. I'm not, you know, the token expert on anything by all means. And I realize that can sound really harsh and make it sound like I don't want to help, because I do, but I also have a job and a family and other things to do, and not to mention in a time that we are in, like in 2020 right now, I got other things I'm worried about. I'm worried about my indigenous brothers and sisters in the Navajo Nation right now and their rates of COVID. You know, and you know what we can do to help them. I worry about the water protectors who are protecting us against, you know, pipelines being put in. I'm worried about, you know, my Black brothers and sisters who are getting, you know, shot in the streets, you know, for just being Black. So there's a lot that happens. And so to rely on just the person of color to be the expert can be so exhausting at times. So don't do it.
Yeah, and I feel like as though you don't have to apologize for that, because as a person of color myself, I understand that even for that person, it may be just one question, but you're getting one question from like 30 people in one day, or you have a life outside of it, and you don't want to always be like, I have to have my knowledge cap on at all times. Sometimes you do want to relax and not have to like be on your toes. Talia,
Yeah,
would you like to add
sometimes
anything about that?
Yeah,
Oh,
sometimes
sorry.
sometimes I just want to veg out on popcorn and watch Friends, you know?
Yes, thank you for saying all of that. It's something we've been thinking a lot about. I think in a lot of industries, but in the theatre right now, we're thinking a lot about how to be actively anti-racist and part of it is how do we invite people into the room? How do we create rooms that are comfortable and that don't make people, first of all, have to do unpaid labor. Like if we hire you, what Larissa satirizes in the Thanksgiving play is this young actress who's brought into the room partly because she's an actress and partly because she's Native American, or they think she's Native American. And so she's supposed to speak for all Native Americans. They don't even ask her what tribe she's from, that she's supposed to speak for everybody, right? Anybody, and she's their legitimacy. And she very quickly says, is that extra pay? She very quickly says that, which is, so I'm very aware of the unpaid labor that people have when they get put in that position as well. And then also it stops white people or the dominant privileged people in the room from having to locate themselves in that narrative. And it's always a narrative of an other when it's actually our history too. Like there's something about that is wrong too in the invitation.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it makes me interested on how even though we say we want to decolonize our minds and we want to work on being a more socially competent society, there's still issues that are underlying because of the system being built on white supremacist values. And there's still like issues of people like, oh, I don't want to give up how I speak this way because that's how I've always spoke. And it didn't hurt this person who it's supposed to hurt. or if there's like mascots of people of color, such as with the Native individuals, where they were like the Redskins, or where they were on the Land O'Lakes, or where the African Americans, and there was the Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben situation. And so it's interesting to think of like, how can we create this space for other identities and other people, but also think of how do we get the individuals into those roles? So how do we actively get the people into the roles, not just to tokenize them, but to actually have them, because it makes more sense for them. Let me give me 1 second. Sorry about that. That's a really long-winded question. Let me make that more concise. How can we like work on having these individuals speak for themselves in a way that they would enjoy, rather than it being in an inauthentic way? So they're their own voices rather than a white individual forcing them to speak.
I think you need to come to it from a place of humility. Like if you're the non-person of color coming to the person of color, I think you need to be humble. I think you need to humble yourself and say, hey, I'm not an expert, and I realize you're not one either, but you know, can you help me with this, or can you help me with that, or what have you? I think, and then understanding that it's okay for that person of color to say no, and not have to, especially in the indigenous community. I feel like from the time Columbus stumbled upon the Caribbean, it's just been exploit after exploit. And we're guarded. We're very guarded. I'm very particular about what I get involved in and what I don't, because I know that there's just been so much exploitation from 1492 on. And so I'm very careful about what I get involved in, and I say no when I don't think it's either going to be a good fit for myself, or if I don't feel like the intentions are true. And so I think if you just approach everything with just a sense of humility, I think that's a really good place to start.
Talia, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I agree. Seriously, I think that approach, even with the first phone call to Heather's office, the question has to be an exchange, right? So I wanted to talk to Heather about how we could build a meaningful land acknowledgement into this production and what action steps, but it has to be an exchange that is like, and that what can this play, we're doing this play, what can it do, how can it be of service to you, as opposed to I need you. I think it has to be an exchange, and a fair exchange, in whatever, and be open to her saying no, because what you're asking something of someone. Yeah, so that's what
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, I think that's totally true. I liked that, how Talia put it, as an exchange. When she, again, like what she said, when she approached me, it was, how can we be of service? How can we make this work? Not, I need you to do something. Like she just said, I mean, I need a Starbucks coffee. It doesn't mean I'm going to get it. It just, it's like, how can we work together? And through, email exchanges and talks, I mean, it was a really good approach from the start. And I'm not going to lie to you, I didn't do this with Talia, but sometimes I won't email or call somebody back right away, because if you're really serious about it, you're going to contact me again. And then I know you're for real. So, and sometimes I have to say no, but most of the time I'll say yes, because if we can work together and it helps me further the history and presence of the tribe that I work for, I'm going to do it.
Yeah, thank you for that. So one of the themes that I believe relates to that in a way is this theme of establishing equity versus like equality, and like how some individuals believe like equality is the way to go, while others are like, no, we have to do equity because not everyone has the same privileges. So how do you suggest we approach conversations of equity versus equality?
That's a good question. I'm a big believer in equity for the experts that you bring in. I have a very good friend who works at a museum campus here in the state of Wisconsin, And prior to her coming in there, the work that the museum was doing with indigenous groups in the area, it was more of an I need kind of basis, and it wasn't they weren't exploiting the tribes, but they weren't necessarily treating them equally or equitably. And so when she came in, she was like, no, that's not how we do business. We are, we're asking people to give of their time, give of their knowledge, give of themselves. And so we need to do that, as equitably as we possibly can. So that, I think that's huge. We do, even in my small little tribal museum, we still do that here, and we reach out to members of our community first when we are looking for programming, when we're looking for people to do talks about our history, talks about our language. We always look to our community first, and there is always some sort of compensation involved, whether that is in gift, whether that is in monetary form, because not everybody comes from the same background. And we want to give, those resources to our people first, and then we move on from there. But it's huge. I mean, I didn't take interns this year because I couldn't pay them. And I believe in, to me, not paying interns is exploitation of labor. And so I think that can be the same when you're working in communities of color. There has to be something there for that person, not because that person demands it, but because it's right. And because of that long history of things just being taken over and over and over again. It's a way of giving back. And I think that's super important.
Yeah, just to add to that, it's a very good question, Destiny. It's one I'm going to be thinking about for a really long time because there's a lot in it. I think that going to people and asking what they need, because they may not need what you anticipate them to needing, if that makes sense. So for example, if you wanted to tell a story, going to someone and asking how it should be told, or whether it should be told in this community, if it's going to be of service to this community, and being really open to the response, so that you're inviting them in on their own terms, rather than just trying to give them everything that everybody else who's already in the system already has. But then I also believe very strongly in pay equity too, and absolutely amen to the whole paid internship thing too. Absolute exploitation otherwise.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I personally believe that we need to utilize equity in order to get to equality, because not everyone was given the same opportunities due to, generational gaps and stuff like this. What would you have to say for individuals who think that equity is just another way of being unfair to other people?
I don't know if I could say what I would say politely. Talia, do you want to go on this one?
I was going to say I don't think they understand yet. Then yeah, I think that it's the beginning of conversations about reparations and things like that. Like, how do you begin? You can't begin on an equal playing field if people haven't started there. So yeah, and one of the things that I hope with this play is that it allows people through laughter to just even understand, to get to that beginning spot that you just alluded to, Destiny, in your question. Like, get to that moment of like, oh, that's me. That moment of realization, so that then they can get into this journey.
Absolutely, 100%. I would agree with what Talia said. I think it's ignorance at that point, and you can't blame anyone for being ignorant. You can blame them for being willfully ignorant, but you can't blame anybody for being, not knowing. And even the people that do know, I know that there's just so many things that, that they just warp things. Like, they think, oh, you live on reservations and you get handouts and blah, blah. That's not how it works. And that's not how the system was actually set up. That's what you were told, and that's what you were perceived. But any funding that we ever get it's because we have treaties with the United States, and there are things to be honored. So it's not handouts. And in college I had a social justice education class, and learning the statistics was, God, it was mind-boggling. And I could see the need for why, there are things such as affirmative action and things like that. Because when you all don't start on that same level field, you need something to level it out. And, as much as I hate it, law school does a really good job at leveling it out, because in order to get in, everyone has to take that LSAT test, right? I've taken it twice. Needless to say, I'm not going to be a lawyer, but I've taken it twice because it doesn't matter what your GPA is. That LSAT sets everybody at the same place. Now, there are questions of equity in standardized testing, which 100% the LSAT fails at because it is a standardized test. I'm a horrible test taker. I mean, I think I would do pretty good in law school if I didn't have to take that darn test. But it's just, I think, just ignorance that we have to overcome. That, as Talia said, if you don't start on a level playing field, you can't all reach the same place.
Yeah, I agree, because there's no way to reach up to the person ahead of you if they already had all these other abilities that you didn't have, whether it's they have networking abilities or they simply have more monetary in their bank account or stuff like that. And what I want to get at is what can be like a call to action. So there's individuals who want to help causes or individuals who want to further their knowledge. How can we, even just the individuals in this panel right now, work towards becoming more active participants in fighting for social justice causes?
Well, I would say you need to watch the Thanksgiving play. I will do that plug. I am not above shameless plugging. But you just need to open your mind more. You need to do your research, reach out to Native scholars, support Native-owned businesses, small businesses. There's some great ones online that have amazing products. Watch a documentary, have a conversation about that documentary you just watched with someone. I think that's something that is like, word of mouth is huge. If you're going to do it in person, obviously be safe and socially distanced, but reach out to those Native nations. Look whose land you're on. But first and foremost, make a list of what is it you want to know. What's the knowledge that you're seeking, and then go out and seek it. I mean, there's people out there who want to help you. We want to talk to you. We want to tell you our history. We want to show you our communities. We want to, show you how far we've come. And, it's super simple to do that. And again, watch the Thanksgiving play.
Thank you, Heather.
Of course.
While you was out in marketing, I had a bit of a wake up a couple of years ago when I suddenly turned around after my theatre training and my history degree and realized how many of the books that I'd read, how many of the texts, the plays, the teachers I'd had were white men. And I realized, I was like, you know what? I need a whole year where I just read novels, plays, histories by women of color is where I went, and I did, and it was amazing. I've got this whole new set of favorite authors. I've got a different perspective, a different. It enables me to watch the news differently. So I mean, that's an action step that's pretty easy to take, and then. The other thing is, yes, that beyond the land, find out which land you're on, but then do the digging further. I think there was a site that was just put in the chat at the beginning. I think Erica put it in the chat. Once you go into that site and you find the land you're on, most of the nations have their own websites and have links within those websites. You can go on a whole journey just in front of your computer, like in the next hour, where you'll slowly build up a knowledge of the Native history, and it enables you to look at, like, just walking around the land, you look at it differently because you realize the history you're walking on. It's incredible, and I highly recommend it to everybody.
Yeah, Talia, I echo your sentiments like 100%. As a writer myself, there was one period of time where I was like, oh, I don't think I enjoy like poetry because, I don't want to read anything by older white men. And then I did a similar thing. I was like, let me read by like poets who are more similar to me, women poets, women of color. And I just like opened my eyes. I'm like, there's so much good out there. And I feel like people don't always have to think about it in oh, I have to go out there and do these big steps. Sometimes you can take smaller steps by watching a TV show with an ensemble of color, with also people behind the cameras, and like reading books by people of color, because it's a new way to see the world, because there's all these stories and we shouldn't be watching it just through a singular lens. And I feel like that's a good way to end the conversation. Declan and Erica have been moderating the chat, so we can know if anyone has any questions, they can, type them in the chat. It's the Q&A section of the panel. So you can either unmute yourself or you can type it in the chat if you have a question for any of our lovely panelists.
While people are thinking of their questions, I have one specifically for Heather, but if Talia has something to say as well, I welcome it. You mentioned something, Heather. You said to be quiet so that you can amplify the voices of people of color, or like if you're in a position of privilege, be quiet so you can amplify the voices of people who are not as privileged. Something that I just like want to know, and as like a white person, is like, how do you be quiet while also speaking up simultaneously? Like, how do you be quiet so someone else can speak while also speaking up for them to show that you're supporting them? Like, how do you do those at the same time? How do those coexist?
So I would counter you by saying that by not saying anything and amplifying their voices, you're already saying something. So it's happening at the same time, whether you know it or not.
Right.
And what you can do when they're not with you is to speak up for them. So like if you and I were like besties and we weren't together, I would hope that if I'm not in the same presence as you, that somebody says something, or they use a derogatory term towards indigenous people, or other people of color, that you'd be like, hold up, not cool, and then, but when we're together, by letting the indigenous person speak and you just stepping back, you're already saying so much right there.
Thank you. Yeah, I always wonder in those circumstances, I don't want it to come off as if I'm not supporting by not saying anything, but I also don't want to take the space. So it's a constant kind of like, in being fully transparent, I just want to like say this because like I don't know how to approach those situations sometimes.
And that's totally fair. I mean, we don't expect everybody to be an expert on everything, but you just do the best you can with what you've got. And I think by pushing those voices of color forward, you're already doing something huge.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions they would like to say? It could be based on some of the topics we discussed, or it can be based on something else that we didn't touch upon, but you would like to know.
There was something I was thinking while people are thinking of questions. It's kind of the opposite of the last question when we were talking about ways of reaching people. I think reaching people through performing arts, that's like one of the best ways, through like humor and plays and stuff. But I was wondering, because such a large amount of the population, I feel, are people who aren't deliberately looking for, to uncover the lies that they've been taught, deliberately looking for books, going out, watching plays and things like that. I was wondering if you guys have thought about ways of reaching those people, or maybe there is no way of reaching those people. So that would be my question.
Well, I share your concern in that question, Drew. I would say that one of the things I'm hoping for, and I have no way of measuring if this actually happens or not, so it's just kind of a fervent hope that I'm putting out there, is that the play will start people thinking, and it'll be conversations that they then bring up with their family, and it'll spill out that way. That they'll watch the show, they might read some of our resources, they might hopefully donate to the Mohican Museum, and it'll start them thinking. There'll be and then when they're talking to their uncle or over Zoom or somebody, you know, then hopefully that will spill out. It's not a very satisfying answer to your question, though, I understand. So
No, I didn't think about it that way. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Well, a question I had personally had to do with the Thanksgiving play, and it was about like the production. So I wanted to know, like, how did this collaboration come about? Because I'm really interested, and I think it's a really great collaboration, but I don't know a lot about like the history about it.
So do you mean the collaboration? You mean how I reached out to Heather, or about the collaboration
Between you and Larissa?
Oh, well, Larissa wrote the play that had nothing to do with WAM. She wrote the play 4 years ago. She tells this story much better than me, so I do recommend looking her up online. She's very prolific, and she's, in my mind, she's kind of brilliant. She wrote the play because she had been writing a lot of work with and for indigenous communities across the US. And then she was writing plays that are set in contemporary Native communities. And literary managers across the country, the sort of the people who read the scripts when they come in and decide what's going to go up on the stage, were saying, we love your plays, but we can't cast them because we don't have any Native actors in our area, which is something that she strongly disputes, especially when she hears it from communities where she knows there to be a large Native artistic population. But she kind of wrote this play as a kind of, fine, I'm going to write you a play with 4 white people in it. And she satirized, that was the beginning, that was the seed of this satire that spilled out. But she said she still had trouble shopping it to people. Like, people would love the play, but it would never get put on stage until, I believe, last year, when it was one of the 10 most produced plays in the country, and she's the first Native American playwright to get that, to get onto that list. And I think there was something about people were ready to talk about whiteness. People were ready to talk about white privilege, something in that space. And she does it so brilliantly. The satire is very sharp, but it's also very generous. There's a generous space in how she sets it up so that you can laugh at yourself without feeling targeted. And hopefully in that way, it opens up your mind to want to learn more. And then we applied for the rights because we loved the play, and her agent gave us the rights. And then I got in contact with her, telling her that we were going to be putting this on, and just talking to her about that. We've been in conversation a little bit through the process, but she's super busy. She's kind of a dynamo, and you should look for her work.
Does anyone have any questions now that they've heard a little bit of the discussion that we've been discussing?
So if there aren't any other questions, what I would just like to say is thank you so much to our panelists for being here. Heather and Talia, thank you so much. And thank you, Destiny, for facilitating the conversation. I really just, thank you. This is just such an important conversation to have. It's something that, like, it's informative for people who don't know, but it's also just really helpful for people to critique themselves and interrogate themselves in their own ways of being, because, like, even I find myself in situations where I'm just like, I don't know how to approach a situation, and being transparent about it is a really vulnerable place to be. And so I just thank you for opening up a safe space for that, to ask those questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. This was really great.
Thank you.
And before we go, I would just like to do a little bit of promotion for the Thanksgiving play. And so I have this slides here. So if you want to see the Thanksgiving play, which I hope you will, you can go see it, and you can sign up for tickets on the website. It's what is the website specifically, Talia? I know it's /Thanksgiving play?
You can just go to www.WAM Theatre, WAM, and theatre spelled with an RE, THEATRE.com. And from there, it'll take you to the Thanksgiving play page and then to the ticket buying page. Yeah. And it's going on for 4 days. It starts on Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and goes on till Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can watch it anytime during that. It's 90 minutes, but it's on demand kind of screening, so you can watch it at any time.
Yeah, that's really awesome and exciting that you can kind of watch it whenever you want, because then you can you can put it on in the background, or you can sit and you can watch it really intensely, but you don't have to watch it at a specific time. And so that's really exciting. Also, they post updates on their Facebook and Instagram. So if you guys want to see it, please go to their website and sign up. And there's also a talk back afterwards with the actors that will be happening on November 24th at 7 p.m. And then also support the Stockbridge-Munsee community. You can go to the website at mohican.com, or they also have the Facebook page. So please go support that. There's also a link on the WAM website of how to support them with funds through that link. And then if you want to keep up with IAH, we also, for students, we have our final fall deadline for mini grants, which you can do work and support different social justice causes and stuff like that through your creative work. And then you also can sign up for our newsletter, which you'll hear about all these different events all the time, just like now, but you'll hear about them through the newsletter, which we send out bi-weekly. And the Empowered Voices Collective. Destiny, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So the Empowered Voices Collective is this online literary platform that I'm doing for people of color, and I'm getting submissions from different disciplines, whether it's poetry, short stories, artwork, or photography. And I'm trying to create this online platform so it can be freedom of expression, but can also just be to express creativity. And eventually, I would want it to be in a published literary journal. But for now, it's this online platform, which I'm working to empower voices, as the name implies. And if anyone here wants to submit and they're a person of color, I would love to get it from them. It's MCLA students or MCLA alumni.
Yeah, and so those applications are now open until the spring of 2021, and then we'll be posting kind of the launch of it next semester. So if you want to submit, please do. And then, as you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a 3-part series. This is part 2. Our third part of the Unlikely Conversations series is going to be about unpaid arts internships, which we actually started to talk about a little bit here today. So it's exciting that we're kind of opening that conversation a little bit here today, but we're going to be talking about that with hopefully some panelists from the Berkshires area who work in the arts industry. So come back for that, please, if you are interested. It's going to be a really great conversation, just like this one. And so we hope that you guys will continue to engage with us. And thank you so much for coming today. Thank you again to our panelists, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you. It was great.